got some vacancies, and there's nothing after February that's firm, or very little after February that's firm. So please consider subjects that you think might interest the group and start preparing. Housekeeping note, cell phones, please, silence, mute, vibrate, whatever. Won't cause a disturbance in the presentation. Our speaker today is Van Smith. He was born in Texas. He went to the Shattuck School in Minnesota, Claremont College in California, and then Yale, where he received a Master in Divinity degree. He has studied at the Young Institute in Zurich, Switzerland. He's had a varied career until the...
Close it off. I'm so sorry.
Ouch.
I hate this thing.
better interrupting me than that. He has had a varied career as a tennis club pro, a tennis coach, and a stockbroker and financial advisor. He came to the shore in 2002 and lives not far away on a farm with a menagerie of animals. So please welcome Van Smith.
Thank you all very much. You can blame this presentation this morning on a recent radio program that I think a lot of you have heard. It was about a month ago, Diane Rain's show with a guest host, and the discussion was about the predominance of diagnosing ADHD and ADD among kids and the medication using mainly amphetamines. Anybody hear it? Somebody heard it, so I'm not making it up, and Jackie heard it.
It's on public radio.
And I had this background in psychology, and it just occurred to me that there's a way to look at this. Now, I'm just going to be wiseacring. This comes with no authority whatsoever. It's just me thinking about this program and putting it together with this background in analysis. When I was in New Haven, I read Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, a very interesting book, and looked up a union analyst, had an analysis, went to Zurich, and really did think about becoming an analyst. But when I went back to New Haven, finished my degree, and didn't go back to Zurich, I had been somewhat disappointed by it. And apart from the fact that I thought it would make a very nice career, I didn't really know that it would give me an answer to the question that I'd been posing to myself. So that's and the thing that this program made me think about was the early days of psychoanalysis. Jung and Freud come to Massachusetts in 1909 up to Clark University, and at that time there was a lot of excitement. We don't feel that excitement at all now. But when this was kind of emerging into the public consciousness, people thought, this could be a thing. And then comes World War I, which visited upon the public mind the unavoidable fact of our proclivity for self-destruction. And so these two things kind of came together in the 20s, like we're a little bit afraid of ourselves, and yet there may be some agency here that could help us. Now that's all I intend to say about psychoanalysis past. And psychoanalysis present has been devolved into a drug therapy for 6 million boys between the age of 6 and 16 with, quote, diagnosed ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder itself. So now, what's the future of psychology? Or is there a future? I don't look upon this as psychology at all. I'm sorry, a psychiatrist and somebody says, okay, Mr. Smart Guy, you've got a 12-year-old climbing the walls. What are you going to do? Well, I'm probably going to reach for the Ritalin, like everybody else does. A hyperactive, misbehaving kid, what are you going to do? But in my journey, and this goes back to the years when I didn't go back to Zurich. A group of us from grad school formed a kind of informal ad hoc group and studied. And one of the things we read a lot of was Ibn Shah's books about Sufism. Tales of the Dervishes, Wisdom of the Idiots, not maybe the thing you want to be telling people you're reading these days. But, and that was very interesting. And then in 1979, I read Bennett's book. During reading all these Sufi stories, you know, a lot of these stories are very much like Tales from the Thousand and One Nights. Sinbad the Sailor, stories with many levels of interpretation. And this kind of seemed like it might lead somewhere. And one of the people that we encountered was George Gurjieff. Not importantly, he didn't play a big part in this, 8 or 10 year study, but he was involved, and we knew of him, mainly through Maurice Nicole's psychological commentaries on the teachings of Gurjieff and Uspensky. But in '79, I read this book, and it really made me think Gurjieff may have more than he's been given credit for. So what I propose to do in this hour, and then maybe we can have all the questions if you're still here. This is going to be, we're going to raise a couple of possibilities that may clear the room. And that's a claim right there. But what I propose to do is to read a few sections, the operative sections of mainly Uspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous. Let me say a couple of brief words about Uspensky and then Gurjieff. You probably know of them, maybe even know more than of them, but let me say a little bit. And then I'll give about 4 passages that I think give us a pretty good alternative to our prevailing view of a lot of things. And then I want to do 2 or 3 more passages in a similar way that show how Gurjieff worked. Okay, we're going to have his point of view, how he looked at things, where he got his point of view, and how that might be relevant to psychology going forward. And then we can, kick it around if you're interested and still here. Uspensky was born in 1870. He was a white Russian, a quite advanced intellectual, wrote treatises on math, New Model of the Universe, a book called Tertium Organum that was very well received in England and established a sort of fan base for it. By the time World War I rolls around in 1914, he's a well-established figure in the Russian and British intelligentsia. But he's a seeker. He's not happy. The resources that he had available to him in the Russian Orthodox Church and also in the medical establishment of that day had not satisfied him. So he, in June of 1914, going out through London, St. Petersburg, London, Suez, he's out in India and Ceylon looking for answers to problems that he's not been able to solve with the resources available to him in either Russia or Victorian England. The war starts in August of 1914, and so he's kind of stuck out there. He makes his way back to St. Petersburg and arrives back from his trip in November of 1914. And he basically was dissatisfied with his trip. It had been cut short by the war, but he had made the trip and he had been able to get a pretty good taste of what was available out there, mainly in Ceylon. But he got back to St. Petersburg, continued, his journal writing, book writing, lecturing, and like a lot of high-level Russians, was kind of back and forth between Moscow and St. Petersburg. And in Moscow, he starts seeing notices about meetings or maybe a dramatic demonstration or something offered by an enigmatic person named Gurjieff. So through the accidental agency of a friend, he meets Gurjieff in April of 1915. And Gurjieff has been in Moscow mainly since 1910. I'll say a little word about him. But this book here, Uspensky was a marvelous editor. It's this book here. It's In Search of the Miraculous. He was impeccable and intellectually very rigorous. And this book, In Search of the Miraculous, is the record of his basically apprenticeship with Gurjieff, which lasted from April of 1915 until about maybe September of 1920. It's 4.5 years. And they didn't completely break up then, but Gurjieff was a phenomenally difficult, demanding person, and Uspensky was a man with a great deal of pride and sense of himself. So he was breaking up with Gurjieff and going off on his own with the clear knowledge that he had this great situation awaiting him in England. So, but now we turn to Gurjieff, and I was trying to think how in the world to present Gurjieff. He's such an unusual character. And to the rescue came Gerrit Verschuur's book on electricity and magnetism. He makes two real good points that I think will help us put Gurjieff in perspective. The first point is, he's talking about how rapid the progress was in the study of electricity, contrasted to how hard it was for us to make gains in the study of planetary motion. And the reason he gives is there's so much received wisdom about planetary motion. No, the Earth is the center, and so on and so forth, and it's in Scripture, and so on. There was just tremendous vested interest against taking this issue objectively. So we have Galileo dying in house arrest sometime in 1630. It may have been as much as 200 years before the church finally gave up and consented to heliocentricity. Whereas between Volta's discovery of the battery, basically, and Faraday's discovery of induction in 1840, say, that's fast for science. That's real fast. We've got a new thing here. We can make a battery for the lab and do some experimenting. And Faraday, this great scientist, is worth comparing to Gurjieff in this way. What Verschuur talks about with Faraday is he was a member as a kid of a Protestant sect called the Sandemanians. He's in South London, poor kid, not really much of a background, and is apprenticed to a bookbinder. And he's just and the Sandemanians have this tenet. It's a very important part of their thing is the believer goes at Scripture without intermediation. You go at it. The book. And what you can come up with is what you get. That's the Sandemanians. And Verschuur observes that this was a tremendous asset to Faraday in his scientific work. He had not had a scientific education. He was a phenomenal outsider. And yet he was able to go at this subject. And Verschuur gives a couple of his experiments. It's just, and he also says this, that Faraday was extremely gifted at learning how to design experiments. He was just off the charts and he's just thinking it out. He wasn't going at it from a traditional point of view. And that's how I want to phrase Gurjieff. We've got psychiatry, we've got Charcot and Freud, Breuer, we're talking about hysteria, all kinds of ostensible advances are being made, hypnosis and so on and so forth, and many cultural preconceptions are defining this area and inhibiting progress. Gurjieff was not involved in this. He was born in Alexandropol and grew up in Kars, and these are remote places out in Armenia. And he was born roughly contemporary with Uspensky, say sometime in the 1870s. He grows up in Kars. The Kars Military Cathedral is where he got his education, so he did have access to a good scientific background, and he was fascinated with science. But like Uspensky, he was a seeker. There were a lot of things that were happening in the world that he couldn't understand and didn't like not knowing about. So he starts making seeking journeys by the time he's 13, 14, 15 years old. In a world where 13, 14, you're on your own sometimes. You're good to go. He got punished some for these really early trips, but he was going, and also since his mother was Armenian, his mother was Armenian, dad Greek, and to live in Kars, which was right on the border between the Russian and the Turkish empires. He spoke Turkish natively, although with an accent in Russian. And Bennett thinks that he spoke Russian less well than he spoke Turkish. But it turns out that if you speak Turkish, you can go all the way from the eastern end of the Mediterranean to Central Asia. You can go to the Gobi Desert and be understood and understand because they're all speaking some Uzbeks and Tartars and Yazidis and so on. There's some form of Turkish that they're all speaking. So Gurjieff, his first seeking trips were like the traditional Mount Athos. He hooked up with the Essenes in Galilee and traveled to Egypt. May have even gotten as far as Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Made overland trips through Iraq. He does not seem to have known Arabic nor Persian, but he finally, and he's getting to be 20, 25 years old, and he's really beginning to focus on some of these classic old towns along the Silk Road. Tashkent, Samarkand, Bokhara, looking for dervish communities, holy men, shamans, anybody who can enlighten him on aspects of the psyche and so on that he's not been able to find help with. And now notice, he's interested in the kind of things that you would study in a psychiatric residency or in an analytic training program. But he's not in an analytic training program. He's out in the windswept wilds of Central Asia without inhibition. There's no restriction on him whatsoever. And Bennett's book entitled A Great Mystery, he didn't care to have people be curious about where he'd studied and from whom he'd gotten his stuff. And so a lot of this is not known. But what is known is lots of dervish stuff, lots of religious people, solitary teachers, meditators, people living in a yurt, all this kind of stuff. He didn't mind. He talked to anybody if he thought they might know something. So that's the setup. Now, I'm gonna read about 4 sections from this book, In Search of the Miraculous, that I feel very lucky to have is a report of this collaboration between Uspensky and Gurjieff. Uspensky the student, Gurjieff is the teacher. And I can read them. I think it might be a little more spontaneous if I just kind of narrate it. It'll be close. It's not going to be word for word, but it'll be close if that's okay. By the way, Jackie. Jack, we have the honor of having someone here who's been along the old Silk Road. In her capacity as a world banker, she's been out there. How do you get out there?
Usually through Moscow, and then down
Go to Moscow.
and then you would go to, Bishkek.
A flight?
Yeah,
Beach?
mostly, yeah.
Okay.
Except for Samarkand, we drove down from the capital city.
From Moscow?
So, no, from Tashkent, right. And so that was a long drive,
Fly
so-
Moscow, Tashkent,
Right,
and then drive to Bokhara.
Samarkand.
Samarkand, okay.
Yeah,
And these are now basically ex-Soviet
yes,
industrial centers,
yeah.
a long way from the romance of the Silk Road.
But they still have the architecture, they still have a lot of the old buildings and so on, as museums, yeah.
Okay. So you can still discern this old world, not camels in the city marketplace, but, okay. I'm going to read about 4 sections of this interchange between Gurjieff and Uspensky, which lasted 4 years. So I think we can get a pretty clear idea of a radically different take on humanity that Gurjieff harvested out there in Central Asia. Then I'm going to read a couple of things about how he used this to work with people. Then we'll have our discussion. The first one, this is like right when they've met. We're in April 1915. Uspensky's back from London. He stopped in London. He spoke to his printers, his publishers, may have given some lectures. And he's talking to Gurjieff about how mechanized London was, the premier city of the world. Trains, trams, electricity, by 15 motor cars, telegraphs. And he's talking about how difficult it is for humanity to resist this mechanization, this encroaching modernity. And I'm going to read this first one because it's very shocking. At the end of which, all of you who want to go get an early lunch are more than understood for wishing to do so. People are turning into machines, I said, and no doubt sometimes they become perfect machines, but I do not believe they can think. If they tried to think, they could not have been such fine machines. So we go on a little bit. Gurjieff says, secondly, the mechanization of which you speak is not at all dangerous. And have you ever thought about the fact that people themselves are machines? Yes, I said, from the strictly scientific point of view, all people are machines governed by external influences. But the question is, can the scientific point of view be wholly accepted? Scientific or not is all the same to me, said G. I want you to understand what I'm saying. Look, all those people you see, and pointed out to the street, are simply machines, nothing more. I think I understand what you mean, and I have often thought about how little there is in the world that can stand against this form of mechanization and choose its own path. He's holding on. This is just where you make your biggest mistake. You think that there is something that chooses its own path, something that can stand against mechanization. You think that not everything is equally mechanical. Why, of course not. Art, poetry, thought are phenomena of quite a different order. He's cornered and he's really scrambling. Art, poetry, of exactly the same order, said G. These activities are just as mechanical as everything else. Men are machines, and nothing but mechanical actions can be expected of machines. So that's your exit line. This is going absolutely against our cornerstone cultural belief. We have will, we're conscious, we can do, we have effect. What we try to do, we do accomplish. That's how we think of ourselves. Not to think this way is to give up on the claim to be human. And it's being specifically and explicitly denied. You're machines. I'm a machine. And when you think about it, you just think about the turmoil of our current world. Yeah, we might have will, we might be conscious, but just in terms of the efficiency of a scientific hypothesis, we want the one that explains the most. And if we can come up with a hypothesis that takes account of more phenomena, explains more facts, that's the winner of the day. And the possibility of us being machines comes way closer to explaining what's going on in the world than the hypothesis that we're conscious, have will, can do, decide. There's none of that. But that doesn't exempt us from continuing to claim our humanity. All right. I'm editorializing way more than I want to. I'm way too much in the Gurjieff camp right here. This is on page 18. What is your opinion of modern psychology, I once asked G. With the intention of introducing the subject of psychoanalysis, which I had mistrusted from the time that it had first appeared. But Gurjieff did not let me get as far as that. Before speaking of psychology, we must be clear to whom it refers and to whom it does not refer. Psychology refers to people, to men, to human beings. What psychology can there be for the study of machines? And here's my theory. I'll lay the cards on the table. Where psychology has failed, I'm claiming that this epidemic of ADHD and drugs and so on is effectively an abdication of psychology to be effective. That it has failed. And it has failed because it has failed to take into account the fact that we're machines. Gurjieff didn't make this mistake. He wasn't fooled at all by our claim, and he wasn't swayed by it. That we have will, and so on and so forth. So we're going to just try an alternative hypothesis. So the next thing that he talks about, and it was always a big part of his remarks, was we're in jail. And he would say things like this: you don't understand your situation. you're in jail. And for a serious person who's in jail, there's really only one thing, and that's to get out of jail. Everything else to an inmate is trivial compared to getting out of jail. And what closes the door of the cell and throws away the key is the belief that I'm not in jail. And what Gurjieff's teaching was about was to give people the opportunity to find their incarceration. Because I don't feel I'm in jail. I also don't think I'm asleep. I'm not snoring. I can go to the store and get back with a quart of milk. And I'm not in jail, right? These are inferences that we make. So the next one is, and this is, he's getting more psychological here. He talks about the multiplicity of our eyes. Well, the next thing that is a cornerstone of our situation as humans is we claim to have an eye. I, Van Smith, you, we've got our eye. And this is an inference from our physical self. So Gurjieff says we have a multitude of eyes. And they're all constellated by external stimuli. Something happens, this brings forth an eye. Something else happens, here comes another eye. And this multiplicity of eyes, the unfortunate thing is we identify, this is his use of the term identify, we identify with every one of these multitudinous eyes that comes up. And he gives this example. I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to get up early, get at it. Okay. Morning comes, I'm not interested in getting up. The guy who decides to get up in the morning is not the same eye that likes to sleep late. In fact, the guy who likes to sleep late, the guy who decides, who's in charge of the decision of whether to sleep late or not, may not even know that this agreement has been reached. And now you can see how Gurjieff would be so effective following this line of thinking at curing people of drug addiction, alcoholism, compulsive behaviors of all kinds. Freud and Jung both tried their whole careers to be effective with hypnotism, whatever you may call it, to help people specifically results. Did you stop drinking? Could you go to the market without having a panic attack? They could not do it. And Gurjieff could do it because he wasn't confined by the idea that he's working on a self. He knows he's dealing with a multitude of selves. And because he's doing this, he can have an entirely different kind of effectiveness with this kind of problem. I'll give you an example. Bennett was the chief intelligence officer for the British staff in Constantinople at the end of the war. A Greek ship owner owns a ship, have interest in a ship that had been during the war requisitioned for troop transport. And he had a hopelessly drunkard son. Nobody had been able to do a thing for the guy. He'd been everywhere. The money was no object. Gurjieff cured him. Bing. And in payment for this, the ship owner gave Gurjieff this half interest in the ship. Bennett himself decommissioned it, transferred title. Gurjieff sold the ship and used the proceeds to take about 100 white Russians from Constantinople, first through Berlin, and then getting to Paris in around 1922. So we've got machines, we've got jail, we've got a multiplicity of personalities, to every one of which we say I. When I'm enraged out of my mind, it's I. And when I'm submissive and cowed, that's also I. And when I'm cunning and ambitious and acquisitive, I. It's not true. There is no I. The whole purpose of the Gurjieff work is to get an I, but we still not to the main core. Here we go. Let's see. Let me find where we are. So we go forward. We're 100 years ago almost exactly. We're in spring of 1916. This group that Gurjieff's had access to in St. Petersburg has been working on this stuff for about a year. And he has asked them to observe themselves and see what they can come up with. Like, how do you respond to things? What's your main feature? If somebody had to describe you in a few words, what would they say? So, the next meeting, here we are. Gurjieff was obviously dissatisfied with our replies. I had already begun to understand him in such circumstances, and I saw that he expected from us indications of something definite that we had either missed or failed to understand. Not one of you has noticed the most important thing that I pointed out to you. That is to say, not one of you has noticed that you do not remember yourselves. This is the cornerstone of the Gurjieff work. You do not remember yourselves. He gave particular emphasis to these words. You do not feel yourselves. You are not conscious of yourselves. With you, it observes. Just as it speaks, it thinks, it laughs. You do not feel. I observe, I notice, I see. Everything still is noticed, is seen. In order to really observe oneself, first of all, you have to remember yourself. So this was a complete smash to Uspensky. And he gives a very interesting account of his effort to think about this. He's in downtown. I've never been to St. Petersburg, but the streets, the Ofitsirgardskaya and the Gostino Dvor, and he's downtown in the center of St. Petersburg. And he is resolved to remember himself. He's going to do everything he can to stay present in his experience. And he does okay. He says it's fitful. Like he was walking down a quiet street. It's like, say, 68th Street going east from 5th or something. It's a kind of a quiet area, but you can tell it's a big street near. And he couldn't do it continuously, but he could do it. He could remember himself. And he gets the idea, okay, this is good. I'm improving, but I'm gonna go work my way back to a bigger street like the Nevsky or some big downtown St. Petersburg. He turns around, he goes back toward this big street, and comes around the corner, and there's his tobacco shop right there. And he goes in, he's going to make an order for some cigarettes. A couple of hours later, he comes to in a public transport about 8 or 10 miles from there. And he could reconstruct exactly what had happened. He had been remembering himself. He walked along, and then he decided to turn around and go back, and he could remember himself with lucidity until he went into the tobacco shop, at which point he completely fell asleep. But not really asleep. He ordered cigarettes. He got back out on the street. He could vividly remember walking down the street and thinking, no, I'm going to cross the street. He crosses the street. Walks down the street, calls it his apartment, writes a couple of letters, phones his printer, goes out, gets on the Eastvox, or however you call public transport, and going along a couple of hours later, it occurs to him that there's something amiss, there's something wrong. And then, and he uses the word coming to, he remembers that he had forgotten to remember himself. And this, I submit to you, is the predominant inherency of contemporary humanity. We all daydream. And not only do we daydream, that's okay. That's the glass half empty. Half full. The glass half empty is that we cannot not daydream. So that we spend tremendous amounts of our time in what can only be called a state of Lord responsibility. And on those grounds, who has explained Nazi Germany? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And even that's okay, because it's a hard problem to answer. How some Austrian lunatic can grab hold of an entire country and run mayhem on the world for 15 or 20 years. How did he do it? Well, I think we can speculatively say that he wouldn't have been able to do it if they hadn't been so prone to sleepwalking, self-suggestion. And this is where, again, you have an opportunity to leave if you want to. The Gurjieff take is that essentially we spend our lives in a self-induced hypnotic trance. And again, in terms of the efficiency of a scientific hypothesis, that is way closer to describing what's going on than that we're conscious and have will and can do. Like now, for example. No mass hypnosis going now? Everything good? Suggestibility at a 0? They won't believe the most absurd, idiotic nonsense? Okay, that's the setting, that's the deal. Okay, I want to do a few more things about, okay, so, this chief inherency, I'm not gonna read it, but I do recommend if you're not totally appalled by these proceedings, to consult Gurjieff. He's talking about this in an interesting way. The way he set up his big book is called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. They're extraterrestrials. They've been living on Mars, and they have a Tescuano. It's full of made-up, unpronounceable words. But their Tescuano is their telescope, and they've been observing life on Earth. And his grandson is with him, and his grandson has become fascinated by the planet Earth. And there's some of these things that are just ununderstandable to him, like these processes of mutual destruction, which are an offensive shame to the entire universe, but which go on periodically on Earth. So it's up to Beelzebub to explain to his grandson how this all works. And early in the book, at about page 75 or 80, he takes up and makes a myth about how humanity fell into its current situation. So I'm going to just redact this myth very briefly. Beelzebub's talking about explaining to his grandson the real issue with humanity from his long years of observing them. That back in the evolutionary development of humanity, there came a critical moment during which it was necessary to enable us to survive and continue, that we had to be deprived of how things really are. We couldn't know, we couldn't see reality. We have the idea that the world is for us, life is for us, we sit atop the food chain, all these charming concepts that we dote on. And if we had to see reality, we would become discouraged and on principle destroy ourselves. So the higher beings, and this is his myth, implanted in the base of our spines an organ kunda buffer, which enabled us to survive and not have to see reality. Then later, this crisis in the life of humanity had passed, and we no longer had to be deprived of seeing how life really is. We don't have to have the illusion that the world is for us or life is for us. We sit atop the food chain, all these things that really we cling to. So the organ kunda buffer was removed from the base of their spines. They were again able to cognate reality. But the inherency remains. Even though it's no longer on the base of our spines, we tend not to like to see reality. We prefer to cling to our illusion that the world is really here to serve us. And I was thinking about this going back to these kids on Ritalin, just in terms of a very, very sketchy take on child psychology. We're rolling along, 3 years old, 4 years old, getting some language, can talk, important to work our way into this family thing, so on. And it's beginning to be clear that it's not a help for me to know what's going on. I can't reach the adults. They're totally out of it. They're inconsistent. Sometimes they're A, sometimes they're C. And they're all daydreaming. They're out on their feet. And I'm not able to reach them. I can't get through to them. And especially, it's very unencouraged to know that they're self-suggesting. Kids, one of the main things kids want to know about adults is what's this thing you're doing when you're daydreaming? And this is the least welcome subject of all. And I could give you examples of being fascinated with my dad's daydreaming, and boy, this is where a disciplinary hammer came down. You're not going to be interested in the fact that I'm not here. And I submit to you that this is a generic, that this is also true for humanity as a whole. We as a whole do not care to know this about ourselves. That we're not here, that we daydream, that we're subject to the most incredible irresponsible actions that we don't even claim. So a child, and I was thinking this the other night, a child, they're good at learning stuff. Maybe it's better for me not to know how I feel. It does seem to be that it's not helping at all for me to know what I want. And most importantly of all, it's very, very bad, as it seems, for me not to, for me to be pointing this out to people. They do not care to be reminded that they basically are in a self-suggested state most of the time. Able to do A, thinking about B. Driving down the road, thinking, talking, you know, the way we live in a completely disjointed, disorganized way. And according to Gurjieff, and I think this is really true about traditional thinking in general, this is the core of the problem. This is where all of our problems, personal and societal, come from. This is, I'm painting with a broad brush, but the fact that we're not really responsible. So Gurjieff's thing is to help his students learn to remember themselves, and by remembering themselves, begin to build a real I. So that when incoming perception, somebody's saying this or somebody's saying that, I don't have to just fall in for it. I've got enough internal resource that I can evaluate it. Wouldn't that be great today? So here I'm going to read a couple of things about, these are the best things I know. Okay, there's our thing. We've got Oregon Kundabuffer, we've got, you know, maybe we all decided to learn to daydream. You know, it may be better for me if I spend most of my time in a trance too. I'll try it. You know, and that's the kind of bargain that's kind of hard to back out of. I'm 6, 7, 8 years old. I've really learned to daydream. I'm fitting in better. I don't know what in the world I think or want or anything. We're doing good. So here, this is Margaret Anderson. She was a literary lion in the 20s and 30s. She and Jane Heap created what was called the Little Review. Their Mycenaeus was Otto Kahn at Kuhn Loeb, so they had money, but they published Hemingway, Dos Passos, so on and so forth. They were the defendants in the Ulysses obscenity trial in 1918. And ultimately, they gave up on literature. They just felt this is not getting there. They had encountered Gurjieff. So they were sort of informally connected to the Gurjieff work, and then in about 36 or 7, they formed a group, asked him to actually take them on as a serious group, and he did this until the end of his life in 1949. But this is the best single thing. Oh, and again, see, he's trying to cure us of our daydreaming. And my analytic question, you know, some analysts, you go to analysis, and sometimes we'll find what we need to talk about. We'll just get going. By the way, the clock's ticking, and this is a darn good deal. So, but other analysts want you to say what you want from your analysis. And mine was of that stripe, and I put down, I don't like my mind. I don't like my relationship with my mind. I was doing okay. I was in grad school, etc. But I felt I was getting the tiniest part of my ability from this thing. I couldn't concentrate, and nobody else could. I just thought we were all operating at such a shamefully low percentage of our capacity, especially me. So you could say that Gurjieff's real issue is to how to teach us to heal this split that occurs in our psyches, maybe sometime around early childhood, when we say, okay, by golly, I'm going to learn to daydream too. You're not going to get me on this. I'm going to fit in. This is page 36 of The Unknowable Gurjieff by Margaret Anderson. On another day in 1936, we were all lunching with Gurjieff in his Paris flat. I had been feeling hopeless about ever being strong enough to do the inner work he demanded. He had asked one of the pupils to give up smoking for a while and to turn her longing for a cigarette into what he called an intentional contact between the ordinary world and a higher world. I felt that his words were especially offered to meet my need, and I quote them here. There are two struggles. He's talking to somebody about giving up smoking. It's a very Gurjieffian interchange. An inner world struggle and an outer world struggle. But these two worlds can never make contact with each other to make data for third world. Even God cannot give the possibility for contact between inner world and outer world struggle. Neither can your heredity do it. Only one thing can give it. You must make an intentional contact between the two worlds. Then you can make data for crystallizing the third world, called by the ancients the world of the soul. So what he's really suggesting is something that's virtually impossible for us to consider, and that is that some blood-stained savage back in the past may have known how to solve pressing problems of ours that we can't solve. In the ancient world, they may have known how to put these two halves of the mind together, and we haven't been able to figure it out yet. And I think the problem of this proclivity of ours being so taboo has had a lot to do with the vast appreciation of Gurjieff's achievement. He's listed in libraries as in the occult. He's a great scientist. He's looking at a very important phenomenon, and he's being objective about it. Put him in the occult? I will give you a small example that will perhaps give you a taste of this intentional contact. You, for example, when you give up cigarettes, you have an outer world struggle, not to buy, not to take, but remember to break habit. And you have an inner world struggle. You imagine how it was when you could smoke. You imagine it in a different way, more keen, with more longing. And it will seem, with this inner world imagining, even more desirable than it had ever been. You will have made this struggle an intentional contact between the two struggles, and even by this effort, you will have made data for the third world. I will tell you one thing to say. I wish the result of this suffering, and it is suffering, you're suffering this wish to smoke. You smoke, you're going to suffer it. You don't smoke, you're going to suffer it. You're suffering. I wish the result of this suffering to become my own for my being. This is Gurjieff, and I think we can cast ourselves back to 1920. He's working with his drunkard ship owner's son. He's saying something very similar to this. When you want to drink, I want you to do this. I want you to think, I want the suffering. And notice this, he's getting him to acknowledge that he is suffering. He's hooking him up to a state that he would otherwise be detached from. He's not aware of himself, he's just drinking. I want you to hold this suffering in your mind while you reach for or don't reach for. And you're going to, in effect, bring these two parts of your fragmented mind together. There's another, he says one other thing. I'm going to paraphrase this because it's going longer than I wanted. There's a lecture that Gurjieff gave in 22 in London to Ouspensky's students. And he's drawing the distinction between essence and personality. Personality is not our own. It's the accumulation of our education, where we grew up, people we've known, traumas that we have or haven't had, how they were dealt with or weren't dealt with. It's an accidental thing. Whereas we have an essence, and according to his chronology, by the time we're 5 or 6, personality really does begin to dominate our essence. And in most cases, essence resides in the unconscious. We don't really have access to it except sometimes and occasionally in trauma. But everything that comes in gets stolen and fitted into a personality context. And the personality is the part that's hypnotized. It's extremely suggestible. That's why we're so suggestible in general, is because it's on the surface. And we can add to it and subtract from it. But so here's what he says at the end. Man is man. He can never be another thing. but he can make his body, i.e. his personality, all this stuff is just visited on us. You know, I didn't do it, you didn't do it, we are who we are. It's 1,000% accidental. A house that the owner has left in charge of the servants, and he's gone on a journey, and while he's gone, the servants misbehave and run amok in the house. And this is even in the parables, this kind of imagery, the Lord gone to a far land. It's also in the Jacob story in Genesis. Jacob is wrestling with something. It's a tremendous battle. It's been trivialized, but it's a tremendous struggle. So when the mind begins to get our habitual selves to work for it, that's very similar to like this parable about the rich man coming back from his journey, and it's not going to be easy. The servants are not really that interested in giving up their gig. I mean, I'm going to have to go back to work and assume my responsibility. We were having kind of a good time. And if you haven't seen Luis Buñuel's Viridiana, it's a great movie done in the 60s about this very thing. The guy goes on a trip, the servants run completely amok in the house. It's a very old story. In scripture, in traditional literature, so on and so forth. And again, we're going to try to heal this split in the mind by having will, remembering ourselves, and getting ourselves to get these accidental things that we're not responsible for, in many cases do not even wish. A lot of things about me I don't like at all. Where'd they come from? And if it's me, I mean, for example, I don't like my posture at all. Well, what about it? It's not mine? And if it's not mine, whose is it? Habits, things you do, things that happen to you in life. I didn't do that. I would never do that. Well, I'm sorry, sir, you actually did do that. The other one is Dorothy Caruso. She was the widow of Enrico Caruso, a woman who lived her life at the very top of everything that the earth has to offer us. Feted, honored, travel the world, meet the very top people everywhere. And she came late to Gurjieff. She, until Enrico Caruso died, but she certainly had no need of anything. But, I hope I can find this. It's a little bit like, wait, 1 second. Well, I can't find it, so I'm not going to waste any more time. She tells Gurjieff he's been demanding something like this thing about the smoking. He wants her to make an effort. And Gurjieff didn't care about effort. Life's tough. Everything requires effort. If you're not making a super effort, forget it. This is going to be hard. So he wants her to do something. She doesn't think she can, and she goes to him, and she's basically going to get a boat and go back to New York. And they're having this kind of last chat, and he says, "Do you know what consciousness is?" And she says, "Yes, it means to know something." He says, "No, it doesn't mean that. It means to know your I." And he goes further and says something that's really, really deep and shocking for all of us, especially when I think about my parents. Excuse me. He says, "You have not," he's talking to this extremely sophisticated, fancy woman. He says, "You have not known your I for 1 second in your whole life." It is so cruel. And so he says, "I'm going to tell you something. You're not going to be able to do this," but notice this is how he works. He said, "I want you every hour to try to remember to say, 'I am.' You're not going to be able to. In fact, weeks, maybe months go by before you suddenly remember through an accidental thought association, 'Oh, gee, that's right, I was going to say I am every hour.' But try. And if you can, you will begin to build this center of gravity in yourself and begin to have what we all presume we have to begin with, and that's an I, consciousness, will, volition, effectiveness." So those are the two. And then I was going to read it. There's a long story I told Jackie and Mal the other evening that I'm not going to go with it unless it comes up later. But I just thought about this last night. Margaret Anderson's sister, Lois, had 2 sons. And one was born in 1911, the other in 1913. Tom at 13, and Fritz Peters, born in 1911. She had a nervous breakdown, the sister. The marriage broke down, so Margaret and Jane adopted these two boys. And Gurjieff opened the Prairie in 1922, and fairly shortly thereafter, Tom and Fritz Peters are sent to the Prairie, kids. And they don't take any part in the work. They're just, and Gurjieff had a couple of nephews and nieces. There was a gaggle of kids around this place all the time. And they were, and I was thinking about this. The nuns doted on her. She was a large woman, but very beautiful and very favored by circumstance. So she really had a nice ride. And then she very quickly is married to this super success. So it wasn't that. And I can give this example, and it's mythifying.
Are you sure? How many months after her husband's death?
Well, now that's also, I don't know.
So this is a segue into, I absolutely agree with your thoughts about what's happened to modern psychiatry. It really has become a slave to the drug companies.
Big pharma.
And big pharma.
And volume.
Yeah. I'm not so sure that Gurjieff is the scientist you think he is, but it's not his fault, because he was coming at a time when genetics, specialty of neuropsychiatry or psychoneurology, and then maybe we'll make some progress.
What you say is well taken, because for whatever reason, maybe I'm mistaken about the taboo-ness of the splitness in our mind, but for whatever reason, the level of research in this matter is lamentable. It's appalling. Why not? Why haven't we done good research on just exactly the area you're talking about? If we had this new tool, I think we could rest assured that Gurjieff would be the first one to be interested in it. Here he says in this, I can read you very briefly, where he sets up this distinction between essence and personality. He says, hang on, when you learn to observe yourself, you will learn to distinguish between what belongs to essence and what belongs to personality. They're even in different parts of the mind. One part is what comes in, what the impressions that gradually coalesce and produce a sense of self. Another part is not dependent on that.
So to just close, if we have any music historians in the room, what was Enrico Caruso like as a spouse? Do we know? Was he an egomaniac? Did she have to feed his attention all the time? Could she have been ambivalent about her relationship to the superstar of the day?
Hang on. I've got this. There is actually, and it's worth me finding if you can wait one more minute, because she does talk about this. Hang on. This was hard for me to find the other day.
Was he a narcissist?
Very likely was. I mean, a guy who's used to standing on a stage.
Narcissists put down women.
Did you say you're a psychiatrist?
A family doctor. We need a lot of psychiatry in the practice of family medicine.
Yeah, exactly. What else is it?
Right, Parker?
Anyway, she does say, and that's very apt, she does say that she was interested in what they were saying on this shipboard conversation because she was a bit disoriented at the loss of Enrico. Voila. Yeah. I don't think I can find it. Darn it. Hang on. Right there. Yeah.
Maybe that question could be answered offline. Are there any other questions?
Other
Yeah.
questions?
I have a comment and a question. Comment is, if these people had functional MRIs, they wouldn't have to use words. Their tools were words. That's the best tools they had in those days. What is your definition of psychoanalysis? I know that part of the topic was the future of psychoanalysis. What do you consider psychoanalysis, and what is its
Well,
future?
I'm just, back to World War I and Freud and Jung and so on. I think the enthusiasm about maybe we'll be able to use science on the products of the mind you'll bring me a dream or you'll bring me a fantasy, and we'll gradually build up a set of parameters that'll enable us to analyze this. I didn't mean to go much further than that.
So
But
you're not
going-
talking about formal 4 days a week
No, no, and
psychoanalysis?
you're not
for
gonna
Woody
get
Allen.
6 million kids into analysis. But, you know, it seems to me that this kind of thinking may hold out some hope. Now, if we're doomed, if our proclivity for self-destruction cannot be affected, I think we're toast. Really? Somebody doesn't want to get a bomb and nuke us now? But if we could get some ideas going, I don't know, here's what I think, that the defeat of psychology, if this is correct to say, was a tremendous confidence breaker for us all. We had this hope that we'd be able to do something about these, as Gurjieff would say in Beelzebub, unbecoming processes that go on among us. Revolution, war, violence, destruction, which we seem to really be hooked on.
But Van, instead we have used psychology actually in reverse.
More or less, there's a good case to be made for that, because it's, you know, anything is a hammer for a carpenter.
Commerce is,
Psychology and psychoanalysis are
No,
sort
that,
of, they're not separate.
well,